In June 1981, police in Paris pulled a suitcase from a pond near the Bois de Boulogne. Inside were human remains wrapped in clothing that carried a Japanese laundry tag. Detectives traced a label to a small apartment on Rue Erasme, home to 32-year-old exchange student Issei Sagawa. According to French court records, the evidence inside linked him to the death of his classmate, Renée Hartevelt, a Dutch literature student. Sagawa confessed immediately, describing the crime as an act of fascination rather than anger. Medical examiners confirmed the details he gave. The case stunned both France and Japan, not only for what had happened, but for what followed, a legal loophole that would allow Sagawa to walk free and later profit from his notoriety. Tonight we reopen the files that turned one apartment into a global question about justice and morality. The heat had started early that June morning. Joggers near the Bois de Boulogne noticed a black suitcase half submerged near the reeds. When officers pulled it ashore, the weight inside shifted. They cut the lock, lifted the lid, and found a scene that would stun Paris. According to the police report filed on June 13, 1981, the contents were human remains. The clothing was foreign-made. A small laundry tag carried Japanese characters. Detectives followed the tag to a quiet neighborhood near the university. Building No. 10 Rue Erasme. A single-room apartment rented by an exchange student named Issei Sagawa. Neighbors described him as polite, shy, obsessed with French poetry. He spoke softly, always carried a briefcase, and spent hours at cafes reading. When police knocked, no one answered. Inside, the smell confirmed what they feared. Court records later documented what investigators found there: photographic equipment, blood-stained sheets, and handwritten pages describing an ideal dinner shared with a woman named Renée Hartevelt. Sagawa was found later that day at his parents' home. He didn't run. He didn't deny anything. He simply said, "Yes, it's true," in his signed statement. Translated for the French magistrate, he wrote that he had loved her too much to let her leave. It was not rage, he said, but curiosity, a wish to understand beauty completely. Psychiatrists called the confession detached, almost academic. Reporters, searching for a headline, called him the cannibal from Japan by nightfall. The story had crossed continents. The apartment on Rue Erasme became shorthand for a question still unanswered. What happens when obsession meets intellect and law meets something it cannot define? Renée Hartevelt was 25, a Dutch graduate student studying comparative literature at the Sorbonne. She spoke several languages, loved Rilke and French philosophy, and believed kindness was a kind of fluency. Friends later told investigators she'd often helped foreign classmates translate assignments. That's how she met Issei Sagawa. Police records and university transcripts confirm they attended the same seminars on modern poetry. To Sagawa, she represented everything he admired about Europe: confident, articulate, effortlessly open. He invited her to his apartment many times, usually to share coffee and discuss Baudelaire. Neighbors recalled hearing music, the faint sound of her laughter drifting through the thin walls. What no one realized was how long he had been planning those meetings. Detectives later found notebooks filled with sketches and diary entries. They weren't violent, but obsessive lists of dinners, conversations, imaginary meals. Psychiatrists described them as an attempt to turn admiration into ownership, in his later testimony. Sagawa said he'd begun to believe the only way to possess beauty was to consume it. That sentence would define the case forever, the fusion of intellect and delusion. Renée's friends told police she never seemed afraid of him. She thought he was fragile, lonely, almost childlike. The last time anyone saw her was June 11th, 1981. She was carrying a folder of notes and a novel in her bag. She told a friend she was visiting Sagawa to help him translate a German poem. She never returned. Forensic files list her disappearance as discovered less than 24 hours before the suitcase was found. Every document since begins the same way. Victim, Renée Hartevelt. Nationality, Dutch. Cause of death, homicide, Paris, 1981. It reads like a single line in a library catalog, but that line changed 2 nations. The arrest was quiet. Police found Issei Sagawa at his apartment, sitting on the floor beside a suitcase identical to the one pulled from the pond. He didn't resist. He spoke softly in English. "I'm the one you're looking for." The official police report lists his demeanor as calm, compliant, articulate. Inside the apartment, investigators found handwritten notes, photographs, and portions of what medical examiners later confirmed were from the victim. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. The crime, as prosecutors later said, had been methodically prepared when questioned. Sagawa described his actions as an artistic impulse. He told detectives he wanted to absorb her essence, a phrase that would appear verbatim in multiple court documents. He detailed how he invited Renée to read poetry with him, and how fascination turned into something unrecognizable. The statement was both confession and manifesto. French psychiatrists immediately declared him legally insane. The court proceedings were brief. Reporters filled the courtroom. Translators repeated every word for international outlets. He was sent to the Paul Garreau Psychiatric Hospital, where he would remain for 5 years. But what shocked the public was not the crime itself, it was what happened next. In 1984, after his father funded legal petitions for transfer, French authorities approved his return to Japan. Upon arrival in Tokyo, doctors found him mentally fit, and because French records had sealed the original file, Japanese prosecutors had no jurisdiction. Legally, he was a free man. The case became a diplomatic paradox. A man found insane in one country, sane in another, guilty in both, convicted in neither. For journalists, it was a moral riddle. For victims' advocates, it was proof that international law had not yet caught up with evil. When Sagawa stepped off the plane in Tokyo, there were cameras waiting. The crowd wasn't angry. They were curious. Within hours, television anchors were calling him the man who returned from Paris with a secret. Reporters gathered outside his parents' apartment. Photographers followed him to cafes, to bookstores, even to therapy sessions. Japan's talk show producers offered interviews. Publishers sent book contracts. In less than a year, Sagawa published In the Fog, a memoir that described the Paris incident in the language of philosophy rather than crime. It sold out in days. Legal scholars called it exploitation. Psychologists called it performance. For the first time, Japan faced the idea of a criminal becoming famous for confessing. The media, critics said, had turned a psychiatric case into a celebrity brand. He gave magazine interviews, appeared in documentaries, and even reviewed restaurants for a tabloid column. Each appearance reopened the wound for Renée Hartevelt's family, who learned about it through foreign newspapers. They released a short statement. She should have been remembered for her mind, not his. By the late 1990s, the fascination had cooled. Sagawa's health declined, and publishers distanced themselves. Yet his face had already entered pop culture, drawn in comics, referenced in films, whispered about in university ethics classes. Every retelling blurred fact and myth a little more. Cultural critics later described the phenomenon as voyeuristic remorse, society's urge to stare at the unthinkable, then apologize for doing it. In the end, Sagawa lived quietly on the outskirts of Tokyo until his death in 2022. He never denied what he'd done, and he never expressed fear of being forgotten. For him, notoriety had become its own form of survival. By the early 2000s, the case had become more than a headline. It was a mirror. Japanese society began to ask why fascination had replaced outrage. Newspapers published essays calling it the age of the spectator. Philosophers compared Sagawa's notoriety to the growing culture of confession on television. The idea that exposure itself had value. Critics pointed out that audiences no longer wanted justice. They wanted access. The story's power came not from what he did, but from how often people looked. Film directors referenced the case in subtle ways. A character reading a banned book. A dinner scene lingering too long on an untouched plate. University classes debated whether free speech protected his interviews or whether silence was a moral duty. Every discipline found its own way to interpret the paradox. A murderer who became a media participant in his own legend. In 2010, a French documentary revisited the original apartment building. The rooms had been repainted, leased, forgotten. Residents interviewed for the program said they hadn't known who once lived there. That ordinary anonymity seemed to disturb viewers more than the crime itself. It proved how quickly collective memory erodes when stories become content. Across Japan, true crime podcasts began to frame the case not as a curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about isolation, sensationalism, and empathy fatigue. One host summed it up: "We looked at him too long, and in that reflection we stopped seeing her." In the end, the real reckoning wasn't legal or moral, it was cultural. The Cannibal chef case forced a modern question that still lingers in every algorithm today. When does documenting evil become helping it live forever? When Issei Sagawa died in 2022, the news barely made the front page. There were no vigils, no protests, no books waiting at the printer. Just a short notice from his family, and silence from the world that once couldn't stop talking about him. For decades, his name had been shorthand for a question journalism couldn't answer. How do you report a horror without feeding it? Younger audiences only knew fragments, clips, headlines, the nickname. Few remembered the victim's real name, Renée Hartevelt, or that she'd been a promising linguist whose thesis on translation remained unfinished. In the years since, her writings have been quietly archived at the University of Leiden. Students still quote her notes on empathy in literature. To understand another person is to translate them carefully. Those lines now sound prophetic. Modern criminology textbooks still cite the case as a turning point for international law and psychiatric jurisdiction. It showed that borders could divide justice as easily as they divide nations. and it warned future reporters that notoriety can outlive punishment. In 2025, Tokyo journalists revisiting the case called it a story that refuses to decay. Each retelling says more about the teller than about the man himself. Some see it as an ethical warning, others as a study of obsession, but in every version, the focus slowly shifts back to the one person who never had a voice in the aftermath. Renée. The files may be sealed, but her words remain. They remind us that even the darkest archive contains something human. A name, a dream, a page that someone once meant to finish. If you thought the horror ended here, you're wrong. What other dark rituals and forbidden practices are still being performed in secret? Dive deeper into the chilling world of haunted ceremonies, banned footage, and eerie folklore that refuses to stay buried. Click on the playlist to uncover terrifying recordings, lost evidence, and disturbing stories they never wanted you to see. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for weekly uploads of spine-tingling footage and dark tales that echo from the shadows. This is the Forbidden's Archive, where the hidden truth and haunting evidence come to life.